This is the final day, or supposedly the final day, and we'll get into the reasons for why I say that in just a minute. But welcome each and every one of you to our program. We're so glad to have you all here. Uh, Man, it has been a roller coaster. That's all I'll say. In fact, calling it a roller coaster undersells how many ups and downs, and more downs than ups we've seen from COP28 this year. But we're really glad to have you on this adventure of ours as we travel through this COP28 mire, the goods and the bads. Unfortunately, I don't really have many good news to read off today. It seems like most of the headlines are mostly circulating around the point that the final draft of COP28 has nowhere, or there's no language inside of it with regard to the phase out of fossil fuels. In fact, most of the headlines today aren't even about what's going on at COP28, or they are, but more indirectly. Most of the headlines are about protests being held back home in individual countries for individuals and citizens who do not like that their delegations sent to COP28 have not come out with phase out of fossil fuel language. In fact, the COP28's UK's Prime Minister for climate change has already left the conference and sparked a number of protests all across the country. If you've seen any pictures of what happened when the Glasgow Climate Conference happened, I believe COP26, there were protests and crowds in the hundreds of thousands. Well, those same crowds seem to have come out for this for the protesting of the UK's climate minister leaving the conference early. And many folks pointing to the fact that if the UK climate minister has left, then that means that the UK has lost confidence that the COP28 conference will include the phase out of fossil fuel language, or maybe deliberate obstruction of potential fossil fuel language coming out of COP28. So it seems like this deal or no deal standoff is causing lots of protests back home. In fact, even in the US, domestically, in Washington, D.C., in Seattle, even in Miami, there have been protests about how the US has not struck a bigger blow during this COP28 for the phase out of fossil fuel language, which is, I think, incredibly interesting and incredibly welcoming for the fact that we do need these protests to be happening right now in order for COP28 to feel that massive pressure coming from across the globe. In fact, I think that even in France and in Spain, there have been protests last night and this morning, depending on where you are in the world. In fact, COP28's biggest headlines right now are simply protests not inside Dubai, but regularly back home. In fact, talking about protests in Dubai, there seems to be some deliberate attempts by the UAE government to prevent any sort of protests at this event. In other words, any news, any media, any images coming out of Dubai should not show any protests whatsoever. That is the message that Dubai is sending. We don't want any sort of mishandling of the public, of protesters happening in our city, so we are not going to allow it. So all these images of protests that you're seeing out there aren't actually from or inside Dubai, or rarely will they be inside Dubai. The hundreds of thousands of crowds are in Glasgow, they are in Washington, D.C., they are across the globe in London, but not actually in Dubai itself. Many of the OPEC delegates to COP28 have actually left. At least it seems like they have confidence that these final agreements that are taking place do not need them, almost as if they have already agreed in principle that the COP28 final draft and text language should not include fossil fuel phase-out language. So oil and gas companies seem to have decided to say, listen, we've done our part. We know that there's no fossil fuel language coming out of this, so we're good to go. So they've left, a lot of them have left the actual conference. In other news as well, it seems that many actually, not just the UK's delegates have left the COP conference, but also it seems like a lot of John Kerry's retinue has also left the COP conference as well, adding to the fuel and fire for protests domestically back home. But that kind of wraps up the headlines that we have for today. Lots of protests, lots of anger across the globe. But now I suppose it's time to head over to our folks who have boots on the ground. We'd like to hear from, John and Dana, what's going on? What have you been seeing on the ground today? Do you see any of the pressure that I am reading of in the headline news?
Thanks, Rock. Great to see you, and great to hear your assessment from outside of Dubai, because we don't see that here. I didn't know that these protests were taking place around the world. I mean, I'm reading headlines, but I'm on the ground here at the COP venue. There are protests going on here. There are a lot of protests. Kids, indigenous people, signs. Of course, they're not they're in the dozens, not the hundreds or thousands, because these are the delegates that are here. I've attended numerous press conferences today with 350.org. John made a funny joke. It's soon going to be 450. Maybe, with the Indigenous Alliance, with Friends of the Earth, with the Republic of Congo, just a stream of press conferences where everybody is expressing their dismay and horror at the sacrifice of the world, really, the future of our planet, by these fossil fuel companies. Everybody feels so betrayed. And some people say, well, there's still hope. They're optimistic. Last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, they really had no hope for the loss and damage, and working overtime, they finally got it through. So there is some sense that something might come through. But I'm not sure that the delegates really walked away from the table, that the real key players walked away from the table last year. John Kerry was slated to have a press conference at 4 p.m. today. It was a no-show. I don't know if he has left the premises as well. People are behind closed doors. They were expecting a new draft by this evening or perhaps tomorrow morning. Everybody is waiting on pins and needles. The media centers are packed. Nobody is going home from here, and discussing with constituents back home and with other delegates, just how do we go forward if the main cause of global warming and climate change, the fossil fuel industry, has no reins, if there's no language which really acknowledges that solving this problem will be the first step towards keeping the planet at 1.5 degrees above industrial level temperatures.
And that's really interesting to note, because a lot of folks have just plain flat out said, we're not hitting 1.5. We are skyrocketing beyond 1.5 at this point, which I think just simply adds more fuel to the fire for these protests happening globally, as they realize that Paris is just this dream that people had 10 years ago, if even it was a dream at this point, even if it was possible. But frankly, right now, I mean, I'm glad you're explaining what's going on the ground here, because I think that these folks across the globe simply just don't realize that this doesn't seem to be as much of a pressure domestically in Dubai as folks may see abroad.
Folks are also,
I think that.
Oh, John's here. Hello, John.
I believe that Hi, greetings. Better late than never. And maybe that ought to be the theme for COP.
Later is too
number
late,
28, John. And they still we're at number 28, and they still cannot get agreement on the fundamental issue that fossil fuels are the problem and need to be phased out or fully abated. And this is, I don't sense the shock and anger here in the venue itself, because I think nobody really expected them to be able to achieve much at this meeting. We came in here understanding where we were meeting, who was in charge. So most of us made certain assumptions as to the outcome. We wanted to give it a chance, but here we are with the evidence at the end. So I'm not sure that people are surprised within COP28. We had our protests yesterday, and as you pointed out, It was largely or entirely people who had badges, blue zone badges, people internal, and there was a large number of them, but they were not focused on a specific issue. They were sort of all over the place on a variety of issues, and I think that is sort of central to the problem. We cannot focus on the primary goal of mitigating greenhouse gases, getting the emission reductions that are required. Instead, we're talking about the secondary issues, which are very important to people's lives, but unless you develop a strategic plan on the primary issue, nothing you do on those secondary issues is going to achieve much. So I'm not surprised that this may be a failure of a COP. And I think what we're looking at is teeing it up for similar outcome next year. I mean, if we're going to another petro state and it's wrapped up in the politics of the Ukraine war and getting Russia's permission as to where we can hold this next COP, clearly there are forces at play here within the UN, and the UN is trying to be, quote, diplomatic and bring everyone to the table, but we're bringing people to the table who have no intention of participating. They're simply using it as an opportunity to block progress by all, which is why, I concluded after about the first or second COP I attended that it was absolutely the case that only technology has the potential to salvage the situation. These governance, international, multilateral governance groups are not going to deliver the goods.
And that context, I think, is incredibly important because walking into Azerbaijan, which not only has a previous track record of running roughshod over Armenia and other local states in that area as a dictatorship and as a power which seems to have pull no punches when it comes to expanding their own influence within the Caucasus region. It does seem like this not only is a very weird choice, but also this is definitely Russia's personal favorite. Which really is going to kind of have this massive specter hanging over it prior to these delegates walking into this conference next year. Because how much influence are we going to imagine Russia has over this conference? If they were able to select the location for COP29, how much influence can we expect them to actually hold over the actual deliberations? I don't even give much hope to the United Nations to actually hold even half of the conference they had this year, given the fact that Russia is going to have such a massive hand influencing COP29. And as we well know, Russia stands to benefit the most over climate change. Not only does the warming of the Siberian tundra offer much agricultural land, but also allows more tapping for oil and gas in that region, which means Russia only stands to win from this game called climate change. And giving them the largest hand at COP29 is going to showcase this inevitability. Which is frankly, I think, outrageous, not only just as an American, but also frankly as somebody who stands to lose quite a bit when it comes to climate change. In fact, somebody who is among the billions who will lose a lot come the inevitability of climate change. So Russia having this large of a hand is probably the worst outcome that we can expect coming out of Azerbaijan. The other alternative to this, thank you, yeah,
paired with a petro state. Well, Russia is also a petro state.
Absolutely.
Well, the United States is a petro state. Yeah. Let's be real about this.
Yeah, the other outcome, the good outcome we can expect possibly out of this is maybe Russia attempting to repair its international reputation. Because when we talk about Azerbaijan hosting this, I think we're really talking about Russia hosting this. So this is potentially, if Russia chooses to do so, this is potentially an opportunity for Russia to regain some of its international standing, as the UN simply would veto any attempts to have COP held in Russia. But Azerbaijan is potentially a way for them to bounce back should they choose to do so. Or Russia can simply say, the West has screwed us over with this Ukraine war, so we're just going to do everything we can to be as obstructive as possible and let this climate change thing just continue to run. So we will.
Well,
I would.
It's interesting that Putin showed up here in Dubai a few days ago or last week. It went to Abu Dhabi, is discussing energy issues, just didn't decided not to engage here at COP. Big influence still this year.
Well, I think that it's not entirely clear how much Russia has to gain in the long term from changes in the climate. True, you know, Siberia is a frozen wasteland, but as soon as it thaws out, it's likely to burn. And furthermore, as the climate problems are exacerbated on the Asian continent, the big problem is going to be people moving out of India, moving out of China, and where are they going to seek to go? Towards Russia. So I don't know that the Russians have an awful lot to gain from these changes. They may think they do, but I'm not confident that that's the case.
Knowing Russia's potential short-sighted attempts in the past few years, and I'm pointing to Ukraine especially, where they think they have a large hand, but in reality they had an extraordinarily small hand and a bunch of mercenaries who didn't show up to the fight. I think that Russia we can expect Russia to either go one of those two pathways. One where they see COP29 as a redemption arc for them to try to gain some international recognition again for actually doing something positive on the international stage, or two, this obstructive as possible event. I don't see it going any other of those two ways.
Well, I think that the best thing the Russians can do to address the climate crisis right now is to find a way to end this conflict in Ukraine and quit wasting so much energy and human lives in that endeavor. Also, by bringing the Ukraine war to a halt without any damage to the nuclear power plants in Ukraine, we could perhaps salvage the confidence that people need to have in nuclear power, that it's safe and isn't subject to inadvertent accidents or deliberate sabotage. So, that's very much in question right now with that war. So, a positive outcome there, not a positive outcome, but a reasonable conclusion to that tragedy is in everyone's interest on the climate front.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. If Ukraine is able to successfully defend, or some sort of negotiation comes out of Ukraine, it will allow for more international talk on the climate front. That is without a doubt true. However, it's right now, it just does not seem like Ukraine will be wrapping up anytime soon. Zelensky seems very confident that he can continue his push to regain the lost territories that were originally taken by Russia, I believe, almost 2 years ago now. Or 1 year ago now. So it's year and a half. Yeah, thank you. Year and a half now. So we will definitely see. Angela makes a wonderful comment here. Russia is building cities in the Arctic for oil drilling, and China, they want to make a shortened transportation route, and definitely working together. Yes, I've also seen those headlines and news stories in the inevitability that climate change does continue to run rampshot all over the world. They definitely will be profiting from those oil and drilling routes in the Arctic, which is definitely something to keep in mind as Azerbaijan, as the COP29 conference comes closer and closer next year.
But it's true that in parts of the global north, in the Nordic countries, I reside in Finland, that the rise in temperatures are actually going to increase our growing time, that we will not have the same devastating impact that countries in the global south have. And those most vulnerable, and these are the people that I was hearing from today in the frontline communities, from the islands, from the marginalized indigenous groups. Those are the people who are going to suffer the most. They are definitely on the front lines. They don't have access to the same kind of resources. Many of them are already living in energy poverty and don't have access to the clean water or sanitation or healthcare that other folks do. Not just in the global south, communities in the United States, indigenous communities, Black and brown communities, they will, when there's a hurricane that happens, when there are floods that happen, they're the ones who are going to be the most vulnerable. And they're the ones that are going to really lose out. This isn't just about, it's about protecting all communities. And this is a very dangerous situation. I know they've been putting in mechanisms with the Green Fund to try to alleviate some of these burdens, but it has to be tied with keeping the temperatures down and in cooperation with all the world's bodies and judicial systems to make sure that there's accountability.
Right. And that very much implies that
some of these.
Go ahead, John.
Some of these topics that we've just been discussing here were raised in a couple of sessions at the U.S. Center by U.S. senators. I didn't attend that, but I watched the video, and both Senator Markey and Senator Whitehouse touched upon these issues of how the overlap between security and climate.
And what did they share, John?
Well, they weren't alone. You know, there were several other senators there, but Markey in particular talked about the conflict in Ukraine and how it had disrupted the traditional energy supplies from Russia to Europe, and how that was having an impact in the United States, with the LNG industry looking at it as an opportunity to fast track a lot of projects that they've been wanting to do. So there's been an enormous growth in the capacity, both in Europe to receive LNG and in the United States to export it. And he was pushing back pretty hard against that.
Yeah, Markey's a real champion of the cause. He understands the vast nuances and complex issues that go into solving this big puzzle.
You know, the other senators on the panels, they had good things to say, but
who else was there, John? There was Whitehouse, Markey.
Right. And Cardin from Maryland. Cardin was sort of leading the session. And then Coons from Delaware, and Murkowski from Alaska, and Tom Carper from Delaware as well. So that was quite a few senators. You know, you've got 5 senators in one location. That's quite the crowd. But Murkowski kept bringing it back to traditional Republican talking points of resiliency and low cost of energy. And again, resiliency was her primary focus. She wasn't talking much about solving the problem, just learning how to better deal with it. And perhaps that's because she's in Alaska, which may fall into the same categories as Finland and Russia. So, you know, politics are what they are. And she was sticking pretty close to the Republican script. Cardin latched on to the theme that I've heard throughout this conference, which, you know, we touched upon, which is migration, how people are beginning to move around within nations and between nations. And Coons talked about taxes, how the Europeans were setting up border taxes on carbon, much in the way that the carbon fee and dividend proposal that Congress never passed in the United States. But the Europeans are implementing such a program that not only would have carbon fees internal to their nations, but as products and services were imported to the EU or to the individual nations, they would have a tax upon the carbon content of those imports. So Coons was talking about how American businesses are going to have to deal with that and how that might result in legislation in the United States to set up similar programs.
Interesting.
Harper,
it's interesting what you say regarding Murkowski in Alaska, because many of us were mortified by the sanctioning of the Willow Project in Alaska this spring. And when we looked more deeply into it, we saw that it was actually the Democratic Congresswoman, Mary Peltola, who herself is Native American, and the Native American communities there, who really voted overwhelmingly to drill in this region because they have few resources and they stand to benefit economically. They would have really been able to provide schools and all kinds of things for themselves from the revenue from the oil. It's a tricky question, even though it was Biden later went on to announce that vast stretches of land would be preserved and protected, but this Willow Project was really controversial.
Yeah, Tom Carper of Delaware he is the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee chair, and he was talking about how the administration is trying to offset some of those financial motivations by, the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. But, the distributed funds of those programs aren't enough to offset the lure of big bucks oil and gas revenue.
Unfortunately.
People will always say that they care about the environment, they care about climate change. But when you give them a choice between more money and less money and tackling some of these bigger problems, all too often they pick the money, regardless of their political affiliations.
Unfortunately, money always wins the talking points at the end of the day. So it seems.
And that's what's
end of the day
up oil money.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very true.
So we may find this dragging on here. Maybe they'll come up with something in the next day. These things always drag on for a day or two after the official close of COP, and many people, as you see behind me, hang around and hope for the best and want to be ready to hear some good news. So we're here hoping, waiting for good news.
And what would be the best news, John? The best news
that they
phasing out of all fossil fuels, unabated or abated. You think that's going to happen?
I don't think it's going to happen, but that would be the good news. And when you talk about challenging the abatement is what we're trying to do on all fronts. We're trying to mitigate the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions, regardless of their source. And we need the technologies for abating and mitigating all sources of greenhouse gases.
Yes, very true. What other sessions have either of you attended on the ground today? I know we will be missing Michael Fidler's content for today, so I'm hoping you might be able to paint a picture of sorts, get that 1,000-word essay out there to showcase what's going on.
There is nothing going on here as far as the pavilions and the sessions.
Lots of press conferences.
Right. But the pavilions, the sessions themselves, the sessions themselves are not happening. The pavilions are all breaking down. A few of them have a reception in there, to thank their people, but that's about it. I saw a lot of folks around taking photographs and enjoying the day and sitting in the cafes and restaurants, visiting with people. So folks were taking a well-deserved break.
Yeah, I think all the real negotiation taking place now are all going to be behind doors, and we won't know the final draft text until it comes out. And I think this is kind of what happens at every single COP conference when they feel the international pressure too much, or when there's just too many people exercising pressure on the actual delegates. They will go into those locked rooms, into the negotiation halls, and they will finalize, hammer out that final deal without any other pressure on them. That's the way it always seems to go at these conferences, which is rather unfortunate because we won't know what the actual text is until the final day. and we will have absolutely no attempts to increase pressure on these folks simply because they will be behind those locked doors. And typically, the most unfortunate thing is in the past, and I'm sure it's the case now, oil and gas delegates will be invited to those closed door meetings, but we certainly won't, which is going to be unfortunate, but that is the reality of the situation. So hopefully Azerbaijan comes out with the right text, because I don't have any faith in this one. All right. Any other news that's happening on the ground?
One final phrase that I keep hearing all day: cop out. This has been copped out. It's a cop out. It's been a huge disappointment for so many. Let's see if it's going to be able to redeem itself. Slim chance, but let's see.
We certainly hope so. We definitely hope so. All right, John, any other final thoughts here before I suppose we close out for today? Oh, you're muted, John.
We simply have to remain hopeful and pursue the avenues of cooperation that may exist outside of this venue. We may not be able to get all 195 or 6, however many nations are part of this process, to agree on certain things. That doesn't mean we as individual nations cannot take very aggressive action that can help solve the problem.
I love that, John. A little bit of optimism out of you, and you are absolutely right. This was also Al Gore's message, that we need to take this beyond the COP, that governments need to agree amongst themselves, that it doesn't have to be every single one of consensus. Each one of us has to start with our communities, our states, our countries, reach out, make those alliances, and do the best we can. I think the United States has made a step forward, and I do think that under the Biden-Harris administration, we have made great strides. It may not be perfect, but we have made the greatest strides in US history. And at least as far as our country under this administration is concerned, I think we have something to vote on in 2024 and a real foundation to build on.
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful closing out message. In fact, if you are a part of those protests that are happening globally in response to COP28 and hearing our message now, good job. If you haven't, get out there, continue the good work, especially if you're in those red states. You need to keep up that pressure as much as possible. There simply is no other way that you can contribute, in a better way than just getting out there and protesting and voting and showing yourself that you are a very strong voice domestically, wherever you are, because not only are we relying on you as we do our work, but you should be knowing that you're relying on yourself. You are the best. You are the best solution. You are the best solution.
Well said.
So without further ado, then, I think that we will bid you all a very fond farewell as we close out our coverage of COP28 in Dubai. It has definitely been, as I said, a roller coaster, and we're really glad to have had you on our journey. Please stay tuned as next year we continue to do this work, continue to showcase what's going on the ground, showcasing not just to the headlines, but the pictures, the actual activities that are happening on the ground. We're really, really glad that you came along this journey with us. So until next year, or until next time, this is the Democrats Abroad and Democratic Environment of Caucus of Florida saying goodbye, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.